Hi, it's Mrs. Cheney. Today we're going to practice 6 different painting techniques with acrylics. You're going to draw a bunch of circles on a piece of canvas paper, and you're going to practice those techniques, making your circle turn into a three-dimensional sphere, or at least the illusion of so. So before we get started, let's gather up our supplies. Okay, and your supplies being you need a piece of canvas paper, okay? Or if you're doing this at home, poster board will work, anything like that. So there's my poster board. I took a roll of tape and I just traced it 6 times on my paper. I also I sketched in or drew a little cast shadow. I'm going to make it appear as if the light is hitting in the top right corner of every single sphere so that its cast shadow is down on the surface. So it looks like it's sitting on the surface of a table. Then underneath it, I wrote out some techniques that I'm going to show you. The first one is called stippling. The second is a transparent glaze with water, a transparent glaze with some sort of a medium, wet on wet technique, wet on wet with a medium, and then an impasto technique that you're going to do with a palette knife. All right, so I gathered that up, got that together. I also have a plate or palette. I used my favorite colors. I used phthalo blue. I did grab orange. They are complementary colors. If you look across the color wheel on those, they mix together to make a great neutral. So they're my favorites. Phthalo blue is my favorite blue. I grabbed some white paint. I did grab black. I don't personally like black paint. It tends to recede, it puts holes in your canvas more or less. I'm not talking about digging a hole through your canvas, but it makes it appear as if a dark area goes back so far that there's negative space. If you don't have black paint, maybe an umber would be the better way to go, like a dark brown. I did get a cup of matte medium, and then a cup of this impasto medium that you mix with your paints. It's very thick. It's very much like sheetrock mud. I have a cheapy palette knife. Okay, you could use a plastic knife. And I've got my favorite brushes. I went digging through. My favorite brush is a flat brush. I like brushes that are flat when I do my shading. That's my favorite brush. This is about, I don't know, 1/2 inch thick. And I've got various sizes. I did grab a tiny one. A larger one would maybe make things go a little bit faster, maybe one that's an inch thick, something like that. I just don't happen to have one on hand. And I grabbed a tinier one. This one is an easel brush. It's a lot longer. It's better to use when you're painting standing up at an easel. But I grabbed what I happen to have. And then I grabbed some oil painting brushes. Oil painting brushes are very stiff, very much like horsehair. And these are round brushes that I'm going to use for my stippling or my pouncing technique. I wrote stippling on my paper. It really is pouncing. I need to erase that. So I have various sizes of that as well. These are pretty beat up. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to make all of my spheres blue. So I am going to go with my blue paint. I'm going to move some of these things out of the way. I'm kind of limited on space here. Okay. Hopefully you can see. So I'm going to start with blue paint. I'm going to grab a round brush, pouncing brush, and I'm going to do this one first. So I'm going to grab my blue paint. You can't see. I'm going to grab some blue paint, and I'm going to take some white off of it because I don't like the pure blue, all by itself. It's not as pretty, okay? So I add a little white to it, and this is the technique you go for, okay? It's like a quick little jump, 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 pounce, 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 pounce. So you can tell I made kind of like a medium blue. And that's the color I'm going with. Getting it really close to the edges. And then moving the paint towards the center of the paper. Well, lines a little bit. As I move closer to my shadow, I'm going to pull more blue in. So that I have a darker side to my sphere. Okay. A little darker as I go around. Now, blue and orange paint make a neutral. So I'm going to grab another brush, or of course I could wash that off, but I'm going to grab another brush and I'm going to pull some orange into my blue paint. Okay? That neutralizes that blue, and I'm going to put that around this edge, along this edge here. I'm not liking how that's looking green under my camera, but you can kind of see how it makes a darker undertone on my sphere. Okay? I'm going to do a touch of black in there. I don't like that green tinge that I've got going. Blue, a little bit of black, a little bit of orange to make that shadow deeper. Okay? So there's my cast shadow. Now, I keep switching brushes because as I move towards my light, I don't want to use the brush that has the dark in it because it's got black in it and orange in it. And if I add white, it's going to turn gray. And I don't want that tone. I'm going to go with a lighter blue. And while this is still wet, I'm going to put my light source on my sphere and blend it out. Go back and add a little more. Until I am satisfied. So this is kind of like a little pouncing technique, more or less. All right, rinse off my brushes. Need to grab myself a paper towel, sorry. Rinse off my brushes, and I am drying them. I never, ever, ever use wet brushes with acrylic. I never put it in. Then it just turns to watercolor. It makes it too translucent. It makes a hot mess. Okay, so my pouncing one is finished, or stippling, whatever you want to call it. I want to show you where an artist would use this kind of technique. Okay, so this kind of technique maybe would be used in trees where they would pounce the little leaves of the trees. That's a place that an artist might use it. Or in clouds, you know, to make that fluffy technique. Or let's say you're painting a cupcake. This one's not a very good example, but you know how cake is kind of crumbly? Right here, here's a good spot. Cake is kind of crumbly, where you might use that technique in there, okay? So those are some examples of places that you might use this technique. Now, my cast shadow, I'm gonna go with grays. Still got a little blue on my brush. Let's get some fresh white. And pull some gray into it. And I am going to paint my cast shadow. I'm just going to go with a flat technique. I need a tinier brush. I'm having trouble keeping that in the lines. Not that I have to, because the stippling technique kind of is rough and gruff anyway. Now, on a cast shadow, it tends to be darker, closer to your subject matter. Okay, and then as you pull out farther away is where you're going to start adding more light gray. So I'm kind of more or less shading my shadow. Now you could argue that, and you can look down at your own cast shadow in the sunshine, and it's a flat gray for the most part, but I like putting a little interest into mine. Okay, all of your cast shadows are going to look the same, so I'm not going to waste time on camera painting all of those techniques. I just wanted to show you a cast shadow on here. So you've got the fuzzy, pounced, or stippling sphere going on this one. Okay, next one, transparent glaze with water. Should have done this one first for the sake of time. We're going to do it again. We're going to pull some blue paint and some white paint. Make myself a little pretty color. Okay, and this one, I'm just going to paint it. So I'm going to paint this whole thing a blue. Medium blue tone. And I am going to pull a little bit more light on this side because that's where we want our light coming from. We don't want to do it too much. We want to make that, okay, all filled in. So I'm going to take a little bit of darker blue and put some over here, but not a whole lot. Okay, under the camera, it still kind of looks like a blue, but it's painted in. I'm going to skip this for now and let it dry. I'm going to do the same thing on this one. Get myself a medium blue going. And I'm going to paint in another sphere. More paint. We're going to let these dry and go back to them, because glazing involves letting the first layer of acrylic paint dry before we go back and add our shading. Okay? So I've got 2 of them done. Put a little more light on this one. Ooh. Got that a little too bright. Some of that paint off my brush. I do not stick it in the water and wash it unless I intend to dry my brush. You don't want to have a messy puddle of paint. Okay, so I got my 2 spheres done. Now, they're not really done. The first layer is done. And of course, I could go in and I could paint my gray bottoms as well, okay, while they're drying. Let me show you some examples of what I'm trying to achieve here. All right. We are looking for, sometimes, we're looking at a cupcake, but sometimes light comes falling down into an area. Like here in the woods, you can see these streaks of light coming through, okay? Like the sun is shining through the trees. Here's another excellent example. That's a photograph of one where the light is streaming down through the trees, right? Or candlelight, where we have this beautiful glow going on right here. All right, in candlelight. So what we're trying to achieve is the idea that we've got light hitting here and a shadow here, and we're going to use what's called glazing. But in order to do that, we have to wait until this dries. So I'm going to move down into my wet and wet. A lot of people think wet and wet is the most difficult to do. I also think it is, but it's also the most common. So once you master wet on wet, you will forever probably use that in everything that you do. So wet on wet, I'm going to start with light, okay? Because with acrylics, I have trouble personally going in and making things lighter. I mean, it's a lot easier to make something darker. So I'm going to put some white paint, you can even see it on the camera, in the area where I want my light to be. And then I'm going to start pulling over blue paint. And I'm going to blend it into the white. Now, if I happen to let that paint get too close into that blue area, or into that white area, the blue paint, I may have to go back, let it dry, and put a little more white on top of it. Grabbing a paintbrush. So I don't like that streak I've got going on right there. That's better. And then as I go down my sphere, I'm going to start adding more and more blue paint. Ooh, I'm happy with this. It's very pretty. If you get your sphere too dark, to the point where you've got to make it darker, you could go in and add its complement, okay, and get even darker with it for in that cast shadow area. So that is made by wet and wet. So in other words, what's going on is my paint is, while it's still wet, I'm mixing wet paint into wet paint. Okay? So I get the surface white, and then I work my way down into my color. I could let this dry a little bit, but then it's not wet and wet, right? The idea is that you pull darks into it. So here's my orange and my blue. I do a little bit more into that corner. That got super dark. Okay, so pull that around a little bit more. There we go. So there's the next one, okay? Now we've got wet on wet with medium. Some people like to take the wet on wet paint, this technique, but they want to add medium to it because they're having trouble getting their paint to flow. I've got really nice acrylic paint. I use, honestly, Crayola brand, Blick brand. I'm not giving a spiel for different paints, but sometimes you squeeze paint out of a tube and it's super thick. So what you can do is add that gloss medium to it, the gloss matte medium. Matte means it's not shiny, and gloss would mean, of course, it's shiny. So I'm going to pull some of that medium into my paint, okay, and do the same exact technique here. Your paint will be a little more translucent. It'll help it flow a little bit more. That's really all it does. The look is the same. Just wanted to give you that option of using it. So I dip into my matte medium and I pull it into my paint and do the same thing. A little too much on my brush. I always hold a paper towel in my hand and then I just go at it. You can't see that under camera. Like, I do this often. And I pull it into my paint, like just to remove it from my brush. My brush just gets too thick with paint. And because it is so glossy, it blends pretty easy across my sphere. And then, of course, I just add more and more blue as I go down my surface. So I don't pour this medium onto the plate or anything like that. I just dip my brush in it every once in a while. That's the effect that, or that's the technique that I go with. And it kind of works for me. Otherwise, you end up with too much of the medium on your plate and you can't get it to blend in. A little more white into that. Okay, and then as I go down my sphere, I'm adding more dark, more orange, adding my matte medium. Same look. All it does, whoops, way out of the lines. All it does is give us a little bit more of a painterly flow to this. Okay. So, where do we use wet on wet? Well, when you paint, it's mostly used for shading. Sorry, showing you the wrong screen. It is used for shading. Examples being like in this cupcake, here in this little swoosh of frosting right here, you can see that there's a white edge to it and then it slowly blends into that peachy pink color and then gets dark. So that's probably where they use that technique in this cupcake, okay? Or down here in the wrapper, you've got light and it slowly fades down into a dark. So that's where you would use that technique. This background here looks like it's pounced, you know, like that. Or maybe they even took a brush, not so much a round brush, but a flat brush to do that same technique with, okay? So that same technique up here, maybe the same thing would happen, but you'd use a flat brush and you would do your marks that way. That's how they got that look, okay? These are almost dry up here. Acrylic dries pretty quick. Now the last one is the impasto knife. Okay, I am not very good at this. What I mean by impasto paint is you use this medium and you mix it in with your paint to get this thick palette knife look to it. Sometimes our acrylic paint is too runny, too thin, and you have to use some kind of a medium to mix in so that your knife marks continue to show, okay? So in this one, I'm gonna grab that other stuff, okay? And I'm gonna mix it in. I'm gonna take this, okay, a bunch of it, I'm running out of plate space here, and I'm gonna take my paint and I'm gonna mix it in with it. So now I've got my white. You have to do a little bit of prep work. Oops, I just realized I'm not on camera. Okay, so I took the medium and the white and I wiped it together. I always have my handy paper towel. And then I'm gonna do the same thing with my blue. I'm gonna take a chunk of this and a 50-50 ratio. I'm gonna pull some blue paint into it a very weird angle here, and do some stirring. It didn't change my color a whole lot. It made it thicker, maybe a tad bit lighter, but really not much. Okay, I'm going to do the last with my orange. I'm going to pull out a chunk of it, put it on my plate, spin around so you can see. And then I'm going to take my orange, and I'm going to mix it in and make my impasto paint with my orange. Okay, I think I'm ready to go. So now, get a clean paper towel. I'm going to paint this last one, move this out of the way. I'm going to paint this last one using these things that I mixed. So I'm going to take my palette knife and I'm going to plop it on there. There's two different techniques I could take. I could do like a pouncing like this. I could stir it around like icing a cake. That's really up to you, what look you want to have on your impasto piece. And then I'm going to slowly start to pull my blue into it. More. Don't know if I mixed enough. Pull some white into that. I am horrible at this. This is not my groove. I really only use a palette knife when I paint mountains and things like that. I really struggle personally with this technique. Okay. I'm going to work it around my sphere. I got to turn this a little bit. I'm having trouble on my camera getting it to bend. You should be able to see what I'm doing. Tra-la! Okay, I don't like these stripes. I've got a white stripe, a blue stripe, a light stripe. Let's put some orange in there for the sake of showing you the dark. Got a little bit of dark going on there. Okay, a little bit more. I don't like the stripes that I have going on. So I'm going to wipe off my palette knife and I'm going to take some more white and I'm going to pull it on top. Play around with it a little bit. Okay. Now I wrote impasto knife down at the bottom. I like that better. Or I'm pulling some swirls into it. A little too much there. Put more white on top. You kind of get the point of what I'm trying to achieve. Okay? So there's my palette knife one. I got a little bit of a weird lump going on down here. But I'm boring you. So we probably need to move on. My problem is my plate is in the way of the camera. I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. Excuses, excuses. Okay. All right, let's go back up to the top. Let's go to these transparent glazes. We didn't finish those. Okay, so there's two different things that you could do. You could take a flat paintbrush. Okay. The first one says transparent glaze with water. I'm going to grab another plate. Hang on. Didn't have enough room on my plate here. So I've got my plate. I'm going to pull, I'm trying to put it where you can see it without smearing all my paint around. I don't know where to go. I'm very limited on my camera space. I'm going to add white paint. I'm going to move some white paint to my clean plate because I don't have a whole lot of room left. Okay, so I'm going to move some white paint to my palette. Okay, wash it off. And what I'm going to do with this white paint is I'm going to add water to it. Okay, transparent glaze with water. So I'm just going to add water to my plate, and it makes it into like a very runny watercolor. Not too much, a little at a time. Okay, and then on the corner, the one with the water, I'm going to start to add my glaze. Okay, so I grab my paint and I start to pull that glaze down over the top of it. This works really good with angel halos, candlelight, things like that. Okay, so a little less water, a little more paint gives us more white. Okay, and where we have more water, of course, it's going to give us a lighter tone to mess with. And I'm going to pull this across my paper. Now, if I get a part where I feel like it's getting too light, I can take blue paint and add a little water. Do the same thing. I can add my shadow down here. I can add my darker and glaze it across the top. That's called glazing. At least that's what I call it, as I pull it up on my board. Now what you're going to find is, as this dries, you're going to notice that it changes. You may have to go back and add more. You may have to go back and add more paint and less water. You may have to add another layer. Okay? It's a process that you have to work through. Adding more blue and less paint or less water. Okay, but that's the glazing technique that we're going for. More yet. Still too light. Okay, may have to let this dry and come back to it because I'm still not happy with this dark corner down here. Try adding that orange. Yep, that helps. Isn't that strange how orange paint, the complement, makes it appear darker? How cool is that? I haven't even used the black. Well, I guess I used the black in my shadow. But I did not use the black on my spheres very much at all. I hate black paint. Black paint's horrible, okay? So there's one. You could do the exact same technique, except instead of water, you use your medium, okay? So it'll look the same. It's, again, just a different way of making a glaze. So I put down my medium first, then I add my paint to it, and I do the exact same thing. So I've got my paint and my medium. If I want it brighter, I have more paint. If I want it lighter, I have more medium. And I pull it across my board, okay? Then I add it to the blue paint, and I do the same thing as I go across. More blue paint, more medium. That one got a lot darker. Woohoo! This one's coming out better. I don't think it has anything to do with the medium. I think it has to do with me. As far as how much blue pigment I put down and that kind of stuff. Okay, let's add some orange. I'm going to add some orange to my plate. Add a little medium to my orange. A little more orange. Okay. And I'm going to pull it on top. Add my dark shadow. Okay? Woo-wee, that's a mess. That got dark too quick. Rinse my brush off. Let's pull off some of that. That's better. Okay, I think you get the point, where you add different types of items or different mediums to get each technique down, and I showed you ways to use them in your painting. All right, so overall, each one has its place. You know, each each painting or each type of technique works in different circumstances. I do believe that your technique is determined on your subject matter and like what you're trying to achieve. All right. I can sit here and play with these for hours. But for the sake of not boring you further, I'm going to stop this now. I would go back and add all of my shadows. I would probably use the wet on wet technique. I could try using a palette knife on this one. Okay. That would probably take me some little tricky handling in there. When you use the impasto, you don't necessarily have to use a palette knife. You could use a paintbrush. You could use your paint and your brush and just put it on super thick. Okay. Same thing. Same idea or concept. It's just that I use something smaller that I can manipulate a little bit better. So that's what I got for you. I think it's good to practice these techniques before you actually create a painting.